Hey, everybody. Welcome to Talking Hockey Sense. My name is Chris Peters. It's episode 116 of the podcast, and we are right in the thick of it. It is after the draft lottery. We know the order of the first, couple dozen picks there, and we'll know more soon with the ending of the next couple of series in the playoffs. But obviously, we now know the San Jose Sharks have the number one pick. We're going to talk a lot about the NHL draft today. We're also going to talk a little bit about some history that's happening in the ECHL right now, and also get you an update on the Clark Cup finals and the USHL, which obviously has draft implications and so much more. But boy, there's just a lot to get to. And the thing that I'm really excited about this episode is that there are a ton of great listener questions that I am super excited to answer. I think that if you are a fan of the NHL draft, there is going to be something that you might want to know that another listener asked, and we're going to talk about it. Lots of different topics, lots of teams covered, lots of players covered. So there is a lot of really cool things that we're going to get to in today's show about the 2024 NHL draft. And of course, as we recorded last week, it was right before the NHL draft lottery. We now know the order of that. And we're going to talk a little bit about the San Jose Sharks and them winning, and really, it's old news now, but we're going to just kind of run through it pretty quickly because obviously, to me, that might have been the most important day in San Jose Sharks history. Yes, you think back to drafting Patrick Marleau, which is undoubtedly a significant moment in that franchise's history. You think back to the many great moments of the Sharks franchise, but of course, it's still without a Stanley Cup. Now they're in a rebuild, and it is a tough situation to be in because it is going to take some time. And really, Mike Grier has a really tough job on his hands because the rebuild doesn't necessarily have all the building blocks in place to build around Macklin Celebrini. But we're pretty sure Macklin Celebrini is going to be that centerpiece of the entire rebuild. And of course, it's a great story because his dad works for the Golden State Warriors. The family lived in the Bay Area for a time. He played for the San Jose Junior Sharks. On our FloHockey Instagram page, we have a video that Celebrini's parents sent us way back when we did the first real profile of him on a feature profile. And to see that, it's kind of a full circle moment for him and also a great moment for their family, that's pretty great too. But really what it comes down to is the San Jose Sharks are a franchise. If you watched any of their games last year, they're a franchise in pretty dire straits as a collective right now because they need a lot more. They fired their head coach. They need to replace him. David Quinn now out. They have some good young players. You think Will Smith, who was drafted 4th overall last year. You think about guys like Shahir Mukhamadullin, different players that are going to be coming in through their system. But really, there's still a long way to go in San Jose. But to have a centerpiece, to have a number one pick, to have it be Macklin Celebrini in particular, this is a player that I think is going to change the complexion of their franchise. It might not be immediately. It might not be for a couple of years. But I really do think that he is going to be a major difference maker for the San Jose Sharks. And I know that, as far as that whole franchise is concerned, the ultimate goal is to win a Stanley Cup. They're really far away from that. But by getting a Macklin Celebrini, say, maybe this is the guy that's the face of our franchise for the next 15 years, and he helps us get there. It's good for hockey in California, for hockey in Northern California. And I think if you are a fan watching on the West Coast, you're going to get a whole lot more to watch in terms of star power, and Macklin Celebrini is going to bring it possibly as soon as next season, and we will see where that goes. As far as the rest of it, think about the Chicago Blackhawks staying at number 2. And really there's a couple of things that's important for is had the Blackhawks won the lottery, moved up to number 1, they'd be out of the draft lottery for a couple of years due to the new draft lottery rules. But because they don't, they actually stay firm. If they have another bad season, they got another lottery pick on their hands. And quite frankly, I think that Chicago is still going to be a little bit of ways away. It's not going to be soon, similar to the San Jose Sharks. But really, the Blackhawks are going to be the team that holds the key to the rest of the first round. And that's really, we're going to talk about it later. We've got a bunch of questions from Blackhawks fans about what they should do at number 2. But there is so much really to break down. We'll get into it as we move forward. But you think about the Anaheim Ducks have another chance to add a major building block to their franchise rebuild that includes so many great young talents. You look at the Columbus Blue Jackets; they're in a very good position to add. And the Montreal Canadiens as well are in a very good position to add a significant piece. And we've got a question later. We'll talk about the tiers of that lottery and of the first round. And we talked about a ton of players last week. You can go back to last week's episode and a lot of the options of players that we that will be available in the lottery range we covered last week. So make sure you check that out. We'll talk more about it. And we're going to talk a lot more about what Chicago's going to do and what other teams are going to do in that Q&A, because we have so many questions to get to, and really don't want to waste time, too much time before we get to that, which is really one of the meaty parts of this podcast. And so we will talk about that shortly. Before we move on to the NHL draft, though, I'm really excited about the hockey that we have on FloHockey right now. And if you haven't yet, make sure you're subscribed, because we have just wall-to-wall hockey all season long. It's never seems to stop. I mean, dozens of games every single day, it seems. And some of the best hockey that I've been watching this year in this postseason has come out of the ECHL. And one team in particular is on a bit of a historic run. So the Toledo Walleye, they have long been one of the best teams in the ECHL, but they have yet to win the Kelly Cup. It's never happened as the Toledo Walleye. They have not won the title. They've come close, but they have fallen short. They have one of the great fan bases in all of hockey, especially the minor leagues. Toledo has this minor league culture where it's the Mud Hens, it's the Walleye, and everybody in the community gets involved and really loves those teams. And so that is really something that, you watch their games and it looks, no different from an NHL game in terms of the fan support perspective. But this is a team that is currently on a 22-game winning streak. Let me say that again, 22 straight games without a loss. 14 games in the regular season, all 8 of their playoff games so far. They swept Kalamazoo and Wheeling in back-to-back series to become the Central Division champions. And now they will play the Kansas City Mavericks in what can only be one of the most highly anticipated conference final matchups that we've seen in this league. And there have been some good ones lately. You go back a few years back to the pandemic year and different, the Fort Wayne Comets and different teams that have been amazing. But this Toledo Walleye team, and this is a team that has a lot of intrigue because, they've come close before. They haven't been able to do it. Well, now they have 3 players that have 11 points so far over the 8 games of the tournament: Riley Sawchuk, Sam Craggs, and Brandon Hawkins. And I've said it before on this podcast. I've said it other places. Brandon Hawkins, one of the best shots in the game outside of the NHL. A really interesting player. They're led by first-year head coach Pat Mikesh, who also coached the Green Bay Gamblers back in the day. He was a longtime USHL coach. His first go at pro hockey, and it's going quite well as he's got the team going. The record for consecutive wins in an ECHL season is 23. That was set by the South Carolina Stingrays a few years back. And 23 straight games, that was all in the regular season. So, the records are a little bit different, but 22 straight games. And now we think back to the Norfolk Admirals that were in the AHL under John Cooper with Nikita Kucherov and a number of other star players that would go on to be big-time players for the Tampa Bay Lightning. I think Tyler Johnson and a few others. They won 28 straight games, including a playoffs, and end up winning the Calder Cup in the AHL. So we're talking about some rarefied air here for the Toledo Walleye. So they're going to put their winning streak on the line against the Kansas City Mavericks, who have the best record in the ECHL all season. They will be squaring off May 17th. Friday, May 17th is game 1 of that series. The first 3 games will be in Toledo. The last 4 will be in Kansas City. The teams work out how the schedule is going to work for the series. So 3 straight in Toledo with that raucous crowd against the team with the best record in the ECHL in the regular season, a team that has done very well for themselves. Just dispatched the Idaho Steelheads in their division final. That is going to be must-see hockey. You can catch it all on FloHockey.tv or via the Flow Sports app. Make sure you are subscribed, because that is going to be some tremendous postseason hockey. So really excited about that. Also on FloHockey this week, also on Friday, May 17th, you will see the Clark Cup finals, and it'll go to game 3 with the Fargo Force holding a 2-0 lead. So the Clark Cup finals are very near its end unless the Dubuque Fighting Saints can pull off a miracle on home ice by winning 2 straight against the team with the best record in the USHL this season. It's going to be tough to do. The Force won the first game 3-1 and the second game 6-3, and that is really what they've done all season long. They have found ways to beat teams. They have found ways to win. They have found ways to do things their own way, and a lot of it is being driven by Max Swanson, who is an undersized forward, but with 16 points in 10 playoff games so far. He has been all world for the Fargo Force and a very likely candidate to be the MVP of the Clark Cup playoffs. He is draft eligible. He is a commit for the University of North Dakota. But again, as a smaller forward, he's had a lot to prove to NHL scouts. But you look at the production, you look at what he's done, and then in the toughest time of the year, he's played some of his best hockey. I think that this is a guy that's definitely worth a late round stab from a team, because otherwise, eventually you might try to sign him as a college free agent. And, undersized players are going to always have to prove it a lot more. But over 2 seasons in the USHL, Max Swanson has really been one of the more productive players that you could ask for, and he has been a big game performer as well. So he has done it well. So Fargo can close out the series as early as Friday. If they don't do it then, it'll go to game 2 on Saturday, and then game 5, a decisive game 5 if it gets to that point, with the Dubuque Fighting Saints being very capable, I might say, of coming back in this series. A very good team, and a best of 5 leaves some wiggle room, and you get 2 games at home. Well, then you would go to a game 5, and that would be on Tuesday of next week. And so that would be an absolute barn burner in Fargo as those 2 teams look to close out the Clark Cup. The USHL, it is just a tremendous brand of hockey, and especially this time of year when it is the playoffs, when it is the Clark Cup on the line, it is a tough trophy to win, and it is one that you can see won on FloHockey. So again, make sure you are subscribed for all of that great coverage. And hey, get the annual subscription so you have all of next season too, and that'll help you so that you don't have to think about it in October. And there's plenty of great stuff that'll be happening over the course of the summer as well. And we'll obviously be covering the NHL Draft. You can get all of our coverage that way. All right, before we get into our draft Q&A, I do have one more thing I want to talk about, and it's the Men's World Championship, and it has some NHL Draft-related storylines, but we're also keeping an eye on Team USA. They have not won gold at the Men's World Championship since 1933, which doesn't seem right, but it is absolutely true unless you want to count the 1960 Olympics, which doubled as a world championship. That is the last time USA won gold in a world championship event. So they have started a little bit rough. They lost their first game to Sweden in a game that was closer than the scoreline dictated. There were 2 empty net goals by Sweden in that one. Then they lost their third game in overtime after falling behind 4-1 going into the third period against Slovakia. This is one of the most talented USA teams that we've seen at the World Championship in terms of the star power. You look at the guys, Trevor Zegras, Johnny Gaudreau, Matt Boldy, Cole Caulfield. There's a lot of really good young players. Brady Tkachuk, Zach Werenski, Seth Jones, Luke Hughes. I mean, this is a team that's got some youth, but they're very talented. Well, it hasn't been a great start for them despite all of that talent, and I think that Team USA, they're still in position to get into the medal round. They're still in position to get in the playoff round, but they're also putting themselves in position to have some of the tough quarterfinal matchups. If they can't get things going here, and both Slovakia and Sweden now in the driver's seat to play more favorable teams in the quarterfinals, though at the World Championship level, there's really no such thing as an easy game. At the World Championship, there's also been a bit of a draft element to it. And specifically, oddly enough, if you have not been watching, the team to watch, if you are a fan of the NHL Draft, has been Norway. Norway has 2 players on their roster that are draft eligible. Michael Brandsted Nygaard is playing a prominent role as a forward on that team, plays for Mora in Sweden typically. He is a first-round candidate, potentially a lottery range pick for this draft as well, would be Brandsted Nygaard. But the guy that has really caught a lot of people's attention, including mine, and he was a guy that caught my attention at the World Juniors as well, is Stian Solberg. And Solberg is a talented defenseman. He's got some physicality to him. He's got a lot of physicality to him, actually. He's physically strong. But what's really impressed me is at 18 years old, at a world championship event, he is a top pairing defenseman, plays on the power play, plays on the PK, does a little bit of everything for Norway. And this is a guy averaging over close to 22 minutes or sometimes over 22 minutes a game for a team that is actually, overachieving a little bit in this tournament. So you take note of that, because the World Championship is probably as close as you can get to mimic the NHL in terms of, he played pro in Norway all year. It's just not a level that typically you see top level draft prospects come out of. But, there has been earlier in the year, there was talk from some in the scouting community, maybe this guy's the next Moritz Seider, kind of playing off the beaten path, playing a prominent role as a young player. I don't know if he's at that level. I don't think he's at that level. But he is at a level that I think is far higher than maybe we thought even back at the World Juniors. And so to watch him play and defend decisively, and to play with some strength, and to play with some smarts and show some offensive capabilities, that's a guy that's now on the rise, a guy that I think you're going to have to keep a very close eye on, towards the tail of the end of the first round into the second round. That's a good player right there. The other guy that we've been kind of watching for the NHL draft, the World Championship, is Konsta Helenius from Finland. And Helenius was expected, at least based on how he was playing in the preliminary games, was to be a top-level forward for this team, to be a top six guy, to be a contributor. And in the games that haven't mattered that much, that's basically what he's been. In the games that have been closer and tougher, he's seen his role diminish. But anyway, so moving along to the rest of the World Championship, Team USA, as I mentioned, not a great start. They do have a few prospects playing for them, not in such prominent roles. Will Smith and Ryan Leonard have kind of alternated as the 13th forward for Team USA. They're getting around 5 to 6 minutes a game. And then you've also got Trey Augustine, who was the young goaltender. And initially, I don't think there was much of a plan to use him as much as they've had to. Alex Lyon, Detroit Red Wings goalie, got hurt and is returned home. And then Alex Nedeljkovic came in to start the next game, and he laid an egg, so they put in Trey Augustine. Well, Augustine has looked very good. He's looked very sharp. 19-year-old goalie, played an under 18, has an under 18 gold and an under 20 gold. If he somehow has this magical story, the Detroit Red Wings prospect is going to do something really special. And all while this is happening, Canada has been playing and playing very well. And who has been leading the way for them offensively but Connor Bedard. So a guy that we talked about so much last year, had that great rookie season, and now he's doing it once again in the World Championship because, well, that's what he does. And whenever he puts on a Team Canada jersey, good things happen. All right. Well, we got through the first part of the podcast, and now we're going and turn it over to you. And I have to say, one of the best things about doing this podcast is getting these insightful questions from the people that listen and the people that cover or that look at the draft and follow the draft so closely. We get really good questions, and as a result, it allows me to hopefully create some answers that help educate you a little bit more about the draft, or at least my perspective on it. And we get some really good feedback from everybody. So I'm super excited to get into our Q&A now and to talk a little bit about the 2024 NHL Draft. And all of these questions are draft related. We have one that is 2025 related if we have time to get to that one. So it all depends on how quickly I'm able to get through this, and hopefully how everything else cooperates. But we're going to start things off. This one comes from Jesse, and Jesse this is an interesting topic because I think it talks a lot about we'll talk about tiers and other things like that as well. But Jesse asks, some teams apparently have Carter Yakimchuk as the number one defenseman. What's his realistic ceiling in this draft? What's the earliest he goes? Now, there are definitely some teams that have Carter Yakimchuk as a high pick. I couldn't tell you exactly how many of those people are how many NHL teams are. And really, it kind of only matters if it's the Blackhawks or the Blue Jackets or the Ducks, a team that has him as the number one defenseman, and if they have him over the forwards. But a realistic ceiling for him, in this draft. I mean, I really do think there's always the potential for a 6'3" right shot defenseman to go in the top 5. I mean, are there people that are going to like him better than Sam Dickinson, Zane Parekh, and Zeev Buium? Probably. Are there going to be a lot of people that like him more than Anton Silayev or Artem Levshunov? I think there are going to be fewer of those. So those are the guys that I think are really competing. But it only takes one team to like a guy enough to go, and we've seen it happen plenty of times before. We saw Dmitry Simashev go very early last year. We saw Moritz Seider go early a few years ago, and we've seen a lot of these defensemen just, their beauty is in the eye of the beholder. So these NHL teams that have these defensemen that are in that range are trying, to figure out these kind of minimal little differences between them. The good news is it's a great year to be looking for a defenseman, because if you don't get a Yakimchuk, you're going to be happy with maybe a Parekh, or maybe you're going to be happy with a Zeev Buium, or a Sam Dickinson, or maybe you have those guys ahead of him already. So I do think that, to me, there's always the possibility. I think the earliest he would go is probably 4. I suppose 3 is at least possible. I don't think that it's necessarily, the competition as a right shot defenseman is primarily with Levshunov. And I think that there are enough people that I've talked to that feel confident that Levshunov is the next best guy at that range. So I don't think it's going to be number 2. I don't think it's going to be not necessarily going to be number 3, but it's possible, because that would also fit a need for Anaheim. But there's a lot of very interesting variables there. But Carter Yakimchuk is one of the real wild cards of this draft, because there are a wide range of opinions on him. There are some that say the offense is amazing. Defensively, it's good enough. There's also people that say, I'm concerned about the hockey sense, even though he put up 30 goals this year. There's still those concerns. So it is very much beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and it only takes one team for him to go high. So I think it's very possible that he can bust up the party in that top 5. All right, our next question is going to come from Dar. And Dar asks, what is Silayev's contract situation, and when will he come over to North America? Well, there's one part that we can answer definitively, at least as far as we know, on that one. And the other question is a little bit harder to kind of get around. So let me take a sip of water and then we'll get into it. All right. So Anton Silayev, we've talked about him a little bit. I think we talked about him last week, and I probably talked about his contract situation a little bit last week, but it's worth rehashing because he is going to be a prospect that is heavily under scrutiny for this draft. And so 6'7", 6'8", somewhere in that range, left shot defenseman. His contract is a little bit longer. And so he wouldn't be available until 2025, 26. That is, that's something that for teams they're definitely thinking about. This contract is recent. This is something that happened. He signed his extension last year, and with that came the opportunity to play a full-time role in the KHL. So 2025-26, I think for most players, they would come over after the end of that contract. Most Russian players want to come to the NHL. They want to be part of the NHL ecosystem. They want to get their contract started. They want to test themselves against the best. When you have a player that has multiple years on his contract, as Silayev does, there's always the risk that they get comfortable, that they get enough money to not feel that pull, that they're comfortable being in the KHL, and that's their whole career. The Carolina Hurricanes are still waiting for Nikishin to come over, and he's probably the best defenseman not currently in the NHL, and they still don't know whether or not he's coming. And so that's the risk that you run with a player like Silayev. I think indications, as far as I've heard, is that everybody believes he wants to come over, would probably come over after that contract. But again, You're waiting for 2024-25, 2025-26. 2 years for a defenseman is not really that long to wait. You think about the Colorado Avalanche had to wait 2 years for Cale Makar. The Vancouver Canucks had to wait 2 years for Quinn Hughes. The teams that the Calgary Flames and then the Carolina Hurricanes waited around for Adam Fox. He didn't want to sign with either of them. But once he got traded to New York, 3 years after his draft. So typically defensemen are going to need at least 2 years post-draft unless you feel like they can jump in right away. Now, he just played an entire KHL season. His timeline might be a little bit different. But it seems to me that Anton Silayev is a no-doubter to come after the 2025-26 season. So as soon as that contract is over, that's when he could come over, and then you have to, see what you got. But he's also a bit of a raw prospect. There's going to be some time for him to develop and adjust the North American game, but I think he's the kind of project a lot of teams want to work with, and that's basically what we know about his contract at this point. All right, well, let's go into at Blackhawks Hockey, and they asks, who would you prefer both as prospects, Demidov or Tim Stützle? So I always like these questions, these hypotheticals. You go back in time. Tim Stützle, of course, drafted the same year as Alexis Lafreniere and has had just a tremendous career to this point. And for a while there, it looked like, hey, maybe he should have been the number one pick in the draft. So with the benefit of hindsight, you'd say, well, I'd take Stützle because I already know he's a top line player in the NHL. As prospects, however, I think that I would probably grade out Demidov a bit higher. I think that there were some questions about Stützle's, basic. He wasn't really filled out yet. He had some strength to gain. He's a much better skater, Stützle is and was at the time. But I think there were still a lot of questions. Whereas Demidov feels like the offense is going to be there. He's going to be a scorer. He's going to be a guy that can do it. We haven't seen him do it against the top level competition, which is certainly a concern. But I still think that, if I'm looking at it objectively between the two of the players, I had Stützle I'm pretty sure I had him third in his draft year in that draft class. I went, Lafreniere, Byfield, Stützle. But, this year it's also a kind of a conversation about Demidov. The other thing about Stützle that I think is interesting is there was, would he be a center long term? Demidov is a wing. I don't see him as a center. I don't see him, but he's a play driving winger, and I think that that's a really valuable thing as well. So if you had to have me pick between those two guys, as prospects specifically, I'd probably lean Demidov. All right, Maxwell, we're going to keep it with the Demidov and Levshunov. Because the Blackhawks fans definitely are going to be asking about this a lot. And this one comes from Maxwell. Could you make the case for Levshunov over Demidov that some scouts in Chicago's draft meetings will be trying to make? So let's get into that. I think if you are specifically the Chicago Blackhawks and you have these specific needs, Ivan Demidov fits a need in the organization, a scoring winger, another complementary piece to Connor Bedard, a guy that can be a high-end offensive player. Or a true defenseman of the future, Artem Levshunov, right shot, big, physical enough, good skater, offensive capabilities. You've got Kevin Korchinski on the left side. You've got a lot of guys on the left side. You don't have many on the right side. So if I'm Team Levshunov, I'm saying this guy is a number one defenseman for us. He's going to be, at worst a number two. He's going to give us that offensive ability on the back end. He defends well. He plays the game like it's, real easily. He's got a short timeline to the NHL, maximum probably a year, just because of how well he played at the NCAA ranks and how he's progressed. And if you're confident in that progression, you're at worst waiting for a year. He might even be ready next season. Do you want to throw him in there? I don't know. I think I probably want to have a little bit of a later timeline on his contract as well. Let him go back to Michigan State. But the other thing that, or I could put him in the AHL too. That's another option the Blackhawks will have available to them since he'll be coming out of the NCAA ranks. So there are options there. I would also say we have developmental options. We have time. We can work with them. We've got the right people. All those different things. I think that's really fascinating to see how that'll work out. But I would say for for the rest of this, for what they're doing with Demidov, I'd say, well, we've got Connor Bedard, we've got Frank Nazar, we've got Oliver Moore, we've got a lot of guys down the middle. But we really need to get some wings. We really need to find some guys that are going to be top six producers. We need a guy that can drive play alongside Connor, that can be a guy that, can get there. Maybe he's not on the same line as Bedard, but then he gives us some balance. If he's a top line wing, maybe that they could be, the duo that becomes our McDavid Draisaitl situation, or maybe our Kane Taves situation. Those are the types of things that you'd be looking at. If I were to counter either of those arguments, and I think that's the important thing here too. So if I'm on Team Levshinov and I'm saying, yeah, but Demidov is another 5'11" forward. He is a guy that, the skating is only okay. He's only played in the U20 ranks in Russia. We don't have a good book on him against top level competition. What happens when things get harder? Does the production go away? Those kinds of things. There's a lot we don't know. As for Levshinov, if I'm on Team Demidov, I'm saying, what are the odds that he's going to be a number one defenseman? Are they, or even a top pairing defenseman? Are they, better than the chances that Demidov becomes a top line scoring winger? We're confident in the offensive ability. We don't think that there's a lot to leave on the table, whereas there's enough development left for Levshinov that maybe we go in a different direction. So that is an interesting kind of way to think about it too, is that you have these needs unquestionably in the wing and and the defenseman. And if you think that you have a guaranteed top line wing that you're confident is going to score, Demidov is the guy. But if you are confident that Levshinov is a number one defenseman of the future, that is going to be the anchor of your blue line, that is going to do all those things, then that's the obvious choice. I think you go to D over wing in most situations, unless that wing is special. And Demidov very well could be special. There are some that say, hey, he's better than Matvei Michkov was last year. And you guys know how much I love Matvei Michkov. I haven't bought that yet. I think Michkov's a genius. I think Demidov is very, very smart and very good offensively, but Michkov had, a better profile. There's a lot to break down there. And to me, if I'm the Chicago Blackhawks, I know that I personally have said I think the decision goes down to Demidov and Levshinov, but they're not in a position to rule anyone out yet. I think you got to look at Salayev closely. I think you got to look at the left shot defenseman closely, even though you have strength on the left side. You've got to look at Caden Lindstrom. You've got to look at Berkeley Catton even. You've got to look at every single option, because this is a critical pick for the franchise. You knew you weren't going to screw up Connor Bedard. Now you have to make it matter more with this next pick. So I think that that's going to be one of the real interesting things for this draft is, what does Chicago do at 2? They hold the key to really how the rest of the round is going to go, because we already know Celebrini is going 1. So they're the ones that kind of hold the key to the next phase and how things are going to shake out. All right. Great questions there. Let's move over to the Seattle Kraken. Haven't gotten many Kraken questions, so I am pumped about this one. It comes from @Manawargs. And the question is, best guess as to who the Kraken might be in on, given that we should have some idea of what they value from their first few drafts. It's interesting. I don't know that we can say much about what they value from their first few drafts. They had the consensus number 2 in Matty Beniers. They get him. Shane Wright kind of falls into their laps at 4, and I still think that there's a lot of evidence, or there's a lot left to be learned about what Shane Wright is ultimately going to be as an NHL player. So that's going to be something to think about. I think it's not exactly what the drafts tell me so much as who they've drafted, and saying they've used their top picks on first round on forwards. This is a team that doesn't have a lot in a blue line prospect pool. Riker Evans has obviously been the guy and is interesting. Is he going to be a top 4 forever defenseman? That remains to be seen. So I think, based on where Seattle is going to be in the draft order, where they're going to be in this whole draft, I think defenseman is the way to go. It's also just a good year to be picking defensemen. I mean, when you're picking defensemen, or when you're picking this high in the draft, there's an opportunity to get a defenseman. So they're picking 8th. There's going to be a run on defensemen before they're able to pick. So they're going to probably have among, Carter Yakimchuk, Zeev Buyam, Zane Parekh, potentially Sam Dickinson. Does Silayev fall? All of those things are up in the air. And at 8, odds are one of the players I just mentioned is going to be available. I don't think Lev Shinov will go any further than 5. And so you've got, you're in a prime zone right here to pick one of those defensemen. And what do they want? What do they need? I think that's another thing that will have to be discussed. And obviously Evans is a good puck moving player, but all these other guys are too, and probably higher value puck movers. I think they're all they all project better than Evans does at this point, even though Evans has shown very well and has proven to be a very solid draft pick in their first year of drafting. But I would say that the Kraken, to me, in terms of their values, I think you have to value the puck movement element. You have to value speed. You have to value all those things. And there are going to be a number of options available to them. So I think, I personally think it'll be penciling in one of Parekh, Buyam, or Yakimchuk, most likely, that would still be available in that range. And whichever is the best of those still there, that's the guy I think you should get. Now, you could also potentially go after, a Berkeley Catton or a Caden Lindstrom if they're still on the board. No guarantees there. But I really think that this is a year where Seattle has to go defense because they really don't have much in that system, in that position. And this is a year to go get it. So great question. Love to hear from our 32nd fan base in the NHL. I guess you're 31st now because of Utah. They're kind of new. So we'll have to figure out exactly how that goes. All right, our next question comes from Tim. And Tim asks, besides his Herculean playoff run, why is Beckett Seneca all of a sudden in the top 5 conversation? Well, it's interesting. I don't know. I haven't heard him in the top 5 conversation, but I think the top 10 conversation has started and it's fired up in a major way. And I think if you watch the way that the Oshawa Generals have sputtered without him in the final against the London Knights, you understand why Beckett Seneca has so many people that have appreciated his game. Now, to look at what he did in this season in terms of, how he's played to date, the reason that he's shot up is that regular season, he was slightly above a point per game in the OHL. For a top-level draft player, it's not amazing production. He has significantly pushed that total forward with 22 points in 16 games, including 10 goals. But I think it's also the way that he has played. He's a 6'2" forward. He can score. He is, making the hard plays. He does get injured in the physical series that they had before the OHL championship. He's out, hasn't played. His last game was against the Battalion was on May 5th, and so he hasn't played since then. And his team is on the brink of elimination from the London Knights, which is an absolute wagon of a junior hockey team. So you watch this player drive a team through the postseason as Seneca has, and it makes you take notice. The same way that Easton Cowan's incredible postseason last year pushed him up into the first round conversation for the Toronto Maple Leafs. And if you look a year later, that pick looks a lot better than it did when it happened. And it was because they anticipated the growth. They saw what he did at the most important time of the season, and they liked what they saw, and they said, that's the kind of player that we want. Meanwhile, you've got Beckett Seneca doing this in a 6'2", probably when he's playing, he'll probably be upwards of 215 pounds at the NHL level. I mean, that's a guy that can impact games for you, especially in the toughest time of the year. So it is primarily driven by the postseason run, because I think the regular season was okay. It wasn't amazing, but the postseason run, you say, okay, well, and I've had this conversation with scouts too. I think it's a good time to have this, where you say, is it more important for a player to be consistent and stay at a certain level all the way? Or is it better to see a player at their absolute peak of their abilities, at the best that they can play, and say, if I can get that version of that player more times than not, because that player has at least proven he can do it, Whereas you've got a consistent player that's, maybe hasn't gotten to that very top of his level. You don't know if he'll ever get there. Whereas this guy, you've at least seen it. So that's a really interesting dynamic. And I think that's the question that a lot of teams are going to be asking themselves about Beckett Seneca. And I think he's a fascinating prospect for this draft and really could bust up things. Does he get above 10? Not out of the realm of possibility based on the chatter that we've heard surrounding him throughout this draft. Top 5, I'm still not there yet, but it's, he's definitely creeped into that top 10 conversation. All right. Richard Colon asks our next question, and this one is there a Keandre Miller in this draft? Big, strong, good skating defenseman, but raw and really needs the right situation. Well, I mean, boy, I loved Keandre Miller as a draft prospect. I thought that, the upside was phenomenal there, and the New York Rangers are reaping the benefits of that upside in the way that he's played, the way that he has grown into his game as an NHL player. Truly remarkable. I think that he's only scratching the surface of where he's going to be. And, the guy that I feel have felt very similarly about is a guy who played in the same program under the same coach. And, that's EJ Emery. And EJ Emery's at the National Team Development Program. I've talked about him a lot on this podcast. He's the guy that in the first round conversation, he's not universally in the first round conversation, but he is for me. He is in that conversation for me because he's big. He is strong, but getting stronger. He still needs to build strength. Incredible athleticism. We've seen a lot of videos of him jumping over people and box jumping and doing all these incredible things. And the thing that really struck me, though, is that his performance at the World Under-18 Championship was very, very kind of like strengthening in terms of how I felt about him as a prospect, because we saw him making plays. We saw him doing things well. We saw him skating. We saw him trying to get into the offensive game. The reason that he may not go in the first round is that there are people that think he'll never have the offense come along. I think that he has enough touch on the puck. I think the hockey sense is coming. I think the feel is coming. The speed, he's still growing into his body. I really, truly believe he's that kind of player. Give him time. He's going to the University of North Dakota. That's a great place for him to develop. Brad Berry has done a lot with a lot of great defensemen. You look at Jake Sanderson. That's a great example. EJ Emery, to me, is one of those guys where you pick him in the middle of that first round or in the 20s, and you are going to get a player that you probably have on your blue line for many years to come. Now, there is risk because the offensive game, if that never comes along, that will be tough. It'll be a much tougher sell to get him into that first round. But if it does come along, you're going to look really good. And I do think it is coming. So that's the guy that I think Keandre Miller, and really Nick Four, the head coach of the National Team Development Program, who coached Keandre as well, basically said they followed a very similar pattern under his tutelage, and that they needed to, get to a certain level defensively before they could bring that offensive element to their game. EJ Emery did that. And Nick Ford said he challenged EJ to become the best shutdown defenseman in his age group. And there have been times where he certainly looked like it. And so that's a player that I find very fascinating, one that I'm looking forward to watching very closely. All right. Our next one comes from frequent questioner Avco Cup, and it says, seems like as the year went on, more forwards have forced their way into being potential first-round picks. How many D should we expect taken in the first round? Boy, I think it very well could be upwards of 12 in this first round. I think it could potentially be more than that. We look at the top guys. You got Lev Schnapp, Salayev, Dickinson, Parekh, Buyam, Yakimchuk. That's just 7 right there, where they're guys that you're like, wow, this is pretty incredible to see. The next tier is a lot lower, I feel like. But I look at guys like EJ Emery, like Charlie Ellick, like Henry Muse. I mean, there are players that are going to get some consideration there. I think there's probably a lot more that we're going to see go in the second round. Big physical defensemen. I think some of the guys that we had kind of pegged as first round defensemen, a lot of them have kind of fallen back, and you say, well, there's enough risk there where I'm a little bit concerned about what they're ultimately going to be. So we might not see as many in that way. But I do think that, we're going to see quite a few defensemen go off the board, especially because I think that the 20 to 32 range is pretty, chaotic, and there's not a lot of consensus in that area. So I'll be fascinated to see where all that goes, but I think we'll see quite a few defensemen go in that first round yet. But yes, you're also right. A lot of forwards have nudged their way in there, and I think that 20 to 32 range is where we could see some real, big swings taken on some of the forwards. All right, let's see here. We've got our next question comes from Justin, and he asks, where is the premier talent shelf in this year's draft? Top 4 defensemen, top 6 forwards. So I think, for me, Celebrini is in a tier all of his own. He's far and away the number 1 prospect. He's the best all-around player. He's the guy that I think has the biggest star potential from this class. But that next tier is really big to me because I don't think there's a ton of separation among these guys. Demidov, Levshinov, Silayev, Catton, Lindstrom, Dickinson, Buyam, Perek, Hellenius, Yakimchuk. Maybe you got Cole Eiserman in there. Maybe you've got Trevor Connolly in there. Those players are in that tier in terms of talent. I think that that's kind of the next phase. I'd probably put the guys that I feel most strongly about being top 4 defensemen. All those defensemen in that tier are in there. I don't have as strong of a feeling. I think guys like Emery are. I think guys like Elliott could be. I think that those are players that are interesting. I think Solin Wallenius could be one potentially down the road. Those players are in, that next wave where I think it's not as firmly. So when we talk about these premier players, we've got those guys, and Cole Eiserman and Trevor Connolly are kind of on the bubble there for that group. I think you could also say the same thing about Beckett Seneca. You could say the same thing about Tisha Ginla. All those players, I think that's where they're at. So I think, Ginla is probably the closest of that group that I just mentioned to being in that next tier of the premier forward. And there are some teams that think he is in that tier. But, I think to me, basically, essentially 11 to 13 players, 14 players is really where I feel like we're going to see that shelf drop off. But that's a great question because I think that's what we think about all the time is not all first round draft picks are created equal. Not all first rounds are created equal. And the further down the first round you go, the more it looks like the same value as an early second round pick, just because that's where we're at. And I feel like this year, that's particularly true because there are a lot of flawed prospects that are going to probably go in the first round that maybe wouldn't have in other years. So always fascinating to see where that drop off is. For me, it's about 14. So that's about where we're at. All right. Patrick has a question about the Ottawa Senators, and his question is best fit for the Sens at number 7. Well, in my mock draft that you can see on FloHockey.tv, I think that Zane Perek, makes a ton of sense there. Is a really talented defenseman. He's obviously, highly productive, and you think, well, here's the organization that brought along Erik Karlsson, and here's a guy that in Perek that had 96 points in the OHL this year and still has a Memorial Cup to play for. I think that's a really good fit. I think him or Buyam, either one. I really like Jake Sanderson long term. I think that's going to be a guy that is a core defenseman for that team. But I look at that and I say if it comes down to Buyam and Perek, I might pick Perek because if I'm a Canadian organization, a Canadian team, I'm probably, based on the way that American players are often looking towards the end of their entry level and their restricted free agency period, looking towards the United States, I might consider going and getting myself a good Canadian boy who wouldn't mind playing a Canadian market. But I have to say, it's not always just about whether a guy's from the U.S. and he wants to play in the U.S. Some of it is about the pressure of the markets. And there's no question that there's more pressure in Canadian markets than there are in American markets. And that makes it a little bit more difficult to hold on to players. But that's why I think, sometimes you say, oh, well, let's get an Ontario kid. Let's get a guy that's been here and actually Perek has spent the last couple of years in Saginaw, Michigan. So maybe he would like to be back in Ontario for all we know. But I would say Perek, to me, I love those two offensive defensemen. I think one of them will be available to the Sens there. I think whichever one of them is, Buyam or Perek, I would take them in a heartbeat because I think they would add a dynamic to that franchise that they just haven't had since Erik Karlsson was gone. And it's not just because they've had Erik Karlsson, it's because those are the types of defensemen that make an impact at the NHL level now. Look at Quinn Hughes, you look at Cale Makar, you look at, Adam Fox, and those are the guys that are winning Norris trophies. They're being impactful in the playoffs and other things like that. So, those are players that you certainly want to see. So I think the offensive defenseman should be among the primary targets for an Ottawa Senators franchise that, still needs pieces to be a contending team. All right. Our next one comes up for who should the Sharks target at pick number 14? And in my mock draft, the way that it went was Cole Yzerman went to 14. And Cole Yzerman, and if he's still available at 14, that might make sense because you've got now a natural scorer. You've got a guy that can play off of Celebrini, a guy that has a history with Celebrini, that's going to Boston University next year. Came into the season as a potential top 5 pick, is not really anywhere in that consensus anymore. But 14 is that's good value. I think that's a great chance. Now, if I'm the Sharks, I'd love to pick a defenseman there. Just don't think it's going to happen, which brings us to our next question, because this is also Sharks related. So I'm going to combine it a little bit. Excuse me. Charlie says the Sharks could really use a high level D prospect, but the way the draft seems to be set up, they don't look likely to get one of the top 6 guys at 14. Is there a team in the 7 to 11 range that you think could prefer a forward and be willing to move down in exchange for 14 plus 33 or 42? Well, man, that's a great question too, because I think, as you look at who's ahead of the Sharks in that 11 range, a team that I might look at is the Buffalo Sabres. I would look at certainly the New Jersey Devils. And I think that there could be something there, because moving down to 14 while picking up an additional draft pick, especially early in the second round, is going to be attractive to some teams, especially teams like New Jersey and Buffalo that have built up their prospect systems pretty nicely, where they have a lot of young players. Buffalo in particular has quite a few defensemen. So you say, well, hey, if there's a way to get in there. Now, the thing is you're still running the risk, because even if you get to 11, that might not be enough. And so, I think it'd be very difficult to get any of Calgary, Ottawa, or Seattle to move off of their picks. So you have to kind of look at that 10 range. And really, I think that's a trade that has to happen before, a defenseman, if there's one left, you have to start working on it immediately, because you say, okay, we need to make sure we get one of Yakimchuk, Buyum, or Parekh, if that's who we think is going to be available, or if Dickinson is available, we got to get up to get him. So I think that is one way to use the package draft picks. I think if it costs you an extra second, or even an extra whatever pick it would, then I would probably give pause and roll the dice a little bit and say maybe, just maybe, one of those guys slips. But I think that if there is a player that you desperately want, if you're the Sharks, then yes, you could potentially move up, because I think moving down to 14 still nets a player for any one of those teams that would be very attractive to them long term. So those are the guys that you could potentially move that pick for. But really, I love these kinds of questions, because it gets into the mechanics of the draft of, especially for rebuilding teams. Typically, I wouldn't advise a team to trade up if it's only a few spots, if it's going to cost you, especially an early second round pick. If I were to do it, I would try to make it my second round pick, because they'll have the first second round pick, which is almost in some years like a first round pick. So I don't think it is this year, but still, either way, that's going to be interesting. So lots for the San Jose Sharks to consider, and that's one that probably happens in the moment on the draft floor if they're that desperate for one of those top tier defensemen. But either way, I think in 14, they're still, like I said, with the talent that we've talked about, 14 is a great range to be in. All right. Our next question comes from Douglas, and this is Cole Yzerman related. I've seen Yzerman everywhere from 5 to 17. That's quite a spread. What slot do you think he will be picked at? Yeah, that's an interesting one. To see the way that his draft stock has fallen this year. It's not a huge surprise. I think that, guys that have the primary skill of scoring goals will often get picked apart most, even though that what they do is really important. And I think that Yzerman has warranted the additional scrutiny. I think that there are things about his game that have made teams a little nervous about him, quite frankly, in terms of using an extremely high pick on him. But to not, to not really beat around it any further, I really do think that Yzerman will not go in the top 10. I think that it's more likely that he is a 13 to 15 pick, maybe 13 to 17 pick. And I do think that part of that is because of the rise of the defensemen, the rise of some of the centers, Catton, Lindstrom, Consta Hellenius. I think that that's part of it. And, I think there are just enough concerns that if it's not completely out of the question that he slips further than that. And again, some of it's him, some of it's just the way the class is shaken out, and that there are players that could be more preferable to other teams. But either way, Cole Yzerman is certainly not as highly, sought after as he was probably coming into the year. And part of that, as we've talked about many times, is because of the apparent lack of real growth in his game outside of, a few things here and there. All right. So our next question is coming from Andrew. And Andrew asks, who is the prospect or prospects who will be drafted likely round 2 that have the most potential to vastly outperform their draft slot, like Logan Stankoven? So this is always tough to predict. I think for Logan Stankoven, it's always the guys that I'll say, like, that I think are going in the second round. They're usually guys that I put in the first round on my personal list. Now, I always say the difference between me and an NHL team is mine are a name on a list and theirs are multi-million-dollar decisions. I had Logan Stankoven ranked as a first-round draft pick in his draft season. I did not have Wyatt Johnston as a first-round draft pick in that season, and they obviously went in opposite order of how I had them. And so Wyatt Johnston has been a tremendous player. So don't want to pat myself on the back too hard for having Logan Stankoven in the first, especially when Wyatt Johnston, who's been the more impactful player, did go in the first, and I didn't have him there. So, the thing, like, one guy that I think is almost certainly going to go in the second round is Cole Hudson. And I have a lot of time for Cole Hudson. I think that he's a player that makes a lot of sense for teams that are looking for that dynamic offensive defenseman that can make plays. I think that there is a little bit missing sometimes from his game relative to, unfortunately for him, he's always going to be compared to his brother Lane. Lane is the more dynamic in terms of his hand skills, but I think that there's, the skating ability that Cole possesses might be better. I think, he's bigger than Lane was in his draft season. He has great vision. He's the all-time leading scorer among defensemen at the National Team Development Program. I mean, there's so many boxes that he checks, but that risk factor of an undersized offensive defenseman, that's where teams say, well, we're gonna probably move into the set. That's a guy we're gonna put in our second round grade. And that's a guy where we're comfortable taking him there. The reason that I have a little more faith in Cole, to potentially move and outperform his draft stock. And it's often these undersized players, but you have to be really selective about the undersized players that you put a lot of stock in. The reason I do is I see that competitive edge that he has. I see that the way that he played one of the best games I've personally seen him play in the gold medal game against Canada. The fact that it was 3 power play goals that essentially beat that team was a testament to how well at 5-on-5 he and EJ Emery played against Canada. And also how big of an impact he had offensively in that game. He had 3 points in that game, including a goal. That's a player that I think will one day outperform their draft stock. Aside from that, it's really tough to say. I think that there are a lot of guys that have skills that could be, Matt Bay-Gridden is a guy that is not really enamored enough scouts, even though he was the leading scorer in the USHL this year. Is that a guy that goes in the second round and then all of a sudden we're wondering later on, how did he last that long? I mean, I think that's one of those players that has that potential. Now, he could still go in the first round. It's not out of the question yet, but that's a guy where you say, well, geez, why didn't he go first? And that's another player that I think we could potentially see in that range. All right. Our last one comes from Alex, and his is the best comparable current NHLer to James Hagens. So James Hagens not draft eligible until 2025. A lot of people penciling him in as the number one pick, and that is potentially right. I think for me, a guy that Hagens has so many different things. Like I love the ease that he plays the game with. I think he's got tremendous hockey sense. I think he's competitive. I think that he really grinds and tries to play really well and play really hard. Now he's a 5'10" forward, and I think when you are average size, essentially, there's a little bit more that you have to prove. I think he's going to have to get stronger and different things like that. But, I think one of the guys that I've seen that I feel like he plays like, at least in the NHL, is probably Mitch Marner. Similar stature, especially his prospects. I think Marner has been a tremendous playmaker. He's got that shot pass threat that, he's probably more dangerous with passing than he is shooting, which I feel is the same of Hagens. And, I think that they're, the play styles are very similar. And, with James, I just see the competitive drive that he has and the fluidity in his game. And, I think there have been a lot of comparisons to Jack Hughes. I don't think he's got quite the dynamic element. He is a very, skilled player, but I don't think he has the same dynamic element that Jack had. But I think that it's very comparable to the way that Mitch Marner plays. So that's a guy that I look at. And, I think, when we're talking about styles of player, obviously, Marner has kind of been a whipping boy for people in Toronto right now because of the playoff things. But I mean, that's a different story. I mean, it's how a guy plays on the ice, and I see that too. So I'm not saying that everything about James Hagens is like Mitch Marner, but I do think the play styles are pretty similar. So that's pretty much what we got today. I mean, like, that was a lot of questions, 15 questions answered. We had more asked that I couldn't get to, which, I mean, thanks for sending them in. It's great. Thanks for bearing with me as I coughed through the show a little bit too. Or maybe you didn't hear it because I edited it out. But either way, who's to say? But yeah, it's been a fun show. And don't forget, if you have not yet subscribed to this podcast on your audio app of choice, do it now. Make sure you leave a rating and review. Let more people know about this. It is the best time of year for this podcast because the draft is coming up. We're going to have a lot more Q&As. We're going to have more guests coming up soon. We're going to talk draft nonstop until the picks are made. And then even after that, we're going to talk and recap it. And then I'll go away for a little while. Can't wait for that. Looking forward to that vacation time. Not that this is anything but fun, because it is a lot of fun. But we'll talk a lot more about the draft on this. You can also watch the podcast on YouTube, on the FloHockey YouTube page, or on the Flow Sports app or FloHockey.tv, wherever you choose to interact with it. That's how you can follow it. Don't forget to subscribe to FloHockey if you want access to the ECHL's Kelly Cup playoffs. The BCHL playoffs are going on right now. We've got the Clark Cup finals. And then, of course, next year we are going to have so much great hockey for you. So, hey, get that annual plan now so that you don't have to think about it in the fall. And then you got it all year round. And you can also enjoy all the other great sports we have here on Flow Sports. That is going to do it for this week's episode of Talking Hockey Sense. Huge thanks to everybody that asked questions, and my thanks to Nikki for producing today. We will see you next week right here on Talking Hockey Sense. My name's Chris Peters. Catch you next time.